Hi, this is Bill, and this is Progpaganda. Over the course of our last several episodes, we've been reviewing the 25 Proto-PROG albums. That is, the 25 albums released in the late 1960s that helped to establish the genre of music that we now call progressive rock. Our first episode in this series presented the full list of 25 albums, including the criteria we used to select them. If you're interested in checking that out, or haven't checked that out before, you can find that episode at this link. We've also, over the course of the past few episodes, gone through in detail many of the albums on the list. We've so far covered albums released in the years 1965, 66, and 67. If you haven't seen those episodes yet, by all means, check those out as well. I think you'll find some very interesting material there. We're coming up on the end of 1967. We have two albums to discuss that were released in December that year, and this episode covers the first of those two albums, released in early December of 1967. We're today discussing the Rolling Stones album, Their Satanic Majesties Request. The Satanic Majesties sessions took place at a particularly turbulent time in Rolling Stones history. Sessions for the album began in February of 1967, not long after the Beatles began their sessions for their classic album, also covered in this series, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. In 1967, the Beatles and the Stones, who knew each other very well, were somewhat friendly rivals. They monitored each other's work pretty carefully and were probably either directly or indirectly, depending upon your opinion, influenced by each other at this time. And so it's perhaps not surprising that there are some songs on Satanic Majesties that used similar techniques to those on Sgt. Pepper. There's, for example, a sitar-based song on Sgt. Pepper, Within You, Without You. There is one on Satanic Majesties too, Gomper, which features Brian Jones and the sitar to great effect. The Beatles were using the mellotron, of course, on songs like Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite and Strawberry Fields Forever. The Stones, of course, made use of it too, on songs like Bill Wyman's In Another Land and on 2000 Light Years from Home, which features some wonderful mellotron from both Brian Jones and Bill Wyman. So a lot of people, when Satanic Majesties first came out in 1967, would opine, the Stones are ripping the Beatles off again. It didn't help that the lead single from the Satanic Majesties sessions that was released at the end of the summer of 1967, Dandelion, also sounded like it was somewhat derivative of the Beatles, and in particular, their recent single, All You Need Is Love. Over the course of the sessions for Satanic Majesties, things apparently grew more and more chaotic, with band members appearing, sometimes not appearing for sessions, some songs being made with only one band member present. Ultimately, Andrew Loog Oldham had enough and resigned as the Stones manager in the late summer of 1967. Oldham, at this time, devoted his energies to his new venture. He founded the Immediate Records label and very quickly signed several acts to the label, including the Small Faces. Steve Marriott and Ronnie Lane of the Small Faces, in fact, appear on Satanic Majesties. So, as a result, Satanic Majesties is the first album that the Rolling Stones produced on their own. And in fact, really, it's the only group-produced albums by the Stones. Jagger and Richards later in the 70s would take on production responsibilities under the moniker the Glimmer Twins. But here, all the different members of the band participated to a degree. Bill Wyman was clearly in charge on his tune In Another Land, so much so that it may have been resented by Jagger and Richards, who, when ultimately the single of the song came out, it was credited not to the Rolling Stones, but to Bill Wyman. That was, in fact, even a appellation that was continued on the album itself. Labels of the album, at least in the United States, mark In Another Land as being credited to Bill Wyman and not to the Stones. So it does make you wonder whether that's a song that the band wanted to leave behind. There's at least one song on the album that is a bit of filler. Sing This All Together and See What Happens is a song that probably could have been left on the cutting room floor without anyone noticing in retrospect. And there are some moments on the album that probably could have been recorded better. As much of a genius in the studio as Glenn Johns usually was, there are a couple of songs recorded during these sessions, in particular The Lantern and Citadel, that at least to my ears sound a bit muddy and possibly could have been done better. Mick Jagger would ultimately go on record as saying that Satanic Majesties was the Stones' worst album. That said, I don't know that I really agree. It certainly is not a traditional Rolling Stones album. Traditional Rolling Stones, both before and after Satanic Majesties, were based in the blues, and there really was not a whole lot of four-on-the-floor blues on this record at all. The Stones, if anything, seemed to want to showcase how versatile they could be in a manner, perhaps again, not unlike what the Beatles did on Sgt. Pepper. To that end, they explored a number of different musical styles, both in the psychedelic realm, but also getting into things like music hall in particular, Sing This All Together and On With the Show, and even to a certain degree, She's a Rainbow, get into that genre of music and does it fairly well. One thing that makes Satanic Majesties really stand out is that where up until this record, Mick Jagger and Keith Richards were by far the featured players on record, Andrew Oldham pretty much dictated that over the course of the Stones' early career. On Satanic Majesties, Bill Wyman, of course, takes a turn in leading the band on his one song. But Brian Jones, in particular, really stands forward and shows his instrumental chops on a number of different songs. I mentioned Gomper and 2000 Light Years from Home in particular. He does wonderful work on those songs. And in general, the musicianship on the album is very, very good. Jones certainly stands out. But one thing also that makes the album unique is that it made considerable use of session musicians. Notably, Nicky Hopkins, who at the time was working largely with the Jeff Beck group, came forward to work with the Stones on this record and would work with them on and off for several years. I mentioned that Marriott and Lane from the Small Faces were involved doing backing vocals on various pieces of this album. John Paul Jones was involved in doing arrangements for She Is a Rainbow, this about a year before Led Zeppelin hit the street. So the Stones pulled out a lot of stops on this album to try and make it work. And while you can argue that the Stones would do better, more cohesive records going forward, this was not a bad album at all. Certainly it was an album that was indicative of its time. I would dare say that if another band besides the Rolling Stones had made this album, there would be no argument about its classic status. It would be viewed, I think, as maybe not a masterpiece, but as a flawed gem of the psychedelic era. As it is, as a Rolling Stones album, it tends to get a bit of short shrift. From a prog rock perspective, this is an album that is a lot of fun and is notable for a number of reasons. First off is the instrumentation. The Stones had a lot of clout in the studio, obviously, given their commercial status at the time. Like the Beatles, they were able to take chances in the studio that a lot of other bands could not, and they capitalized on that. The Stones' use of non-traditional rock and roll instruments and of string and horn arrangements, courtesy of John Paul Jones, was obviously something that found its way into the progressive rock canon in later years. So this is an album that isn't really prog rock. It certainly isn't really a Stones album, but is one that definitely made its mark and is a really enjoyable listen. If you haven't heard it in a while, go back and listen. I think you'll be impressed at some of what you hear. That's all for this episode. Hope you enjoyed it. If you are enjoying this series, please click on the like button for this episode. Click on subscribe for the series. We have one more album to cover from 1967. That one is the first album from Steve Winwood, Dave Mason, and Traffic, which came out shortly after Satanic Majesties, just before the end of the year of 1967. We'll cover that one in our next episode, and then on to 1968, which was a very busy year as far as artists who shaped progressive rock were concerned. Thanks for listening. We'll see you again soon. Take care.